ابني منى قالت لي عصب ابنك لانه اعطيتك الرابط تبع القناه، وقالت لي لا تبعتيها لحدا لانه لسه مو هي القناه الاساسيه، قناه تجريبيه. والله العظيم بدون ما تقلي انا ما حابعتها لحدا، يعني حتى انت تقلي ماما اذا بدك تعطيها لحدا اعطيها لحدا، لاني بعرفك وبعرف مخك. اذا صوره ما بتحبني انشرها لورجيك اياها قبل او لاسالك، فاكيد ما لا 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 يكن لك فكره تقبرني، لا يكن لك فكره. شلونك؟ شو اخبارك؟ طمني عنك. شو في ما في؟ شو عندك اليوم؟ كيف الدراسة؟ كيف أمورك؟
If you are live streaming, then I suppose chances are pretty high that in some way or fashion you are rescaling your video. So you're playing, for example, in 1080p or in 1440p, and you then rescale your video to a lower resolution, which is feasible to being live streamed over the internet. Now, OBS Studio provides 3 different methods to rescale your output, and 2 of these have different filters, meaning in total there are 9 different methods on how you can rescale your live stream. But which out of all of these options actually provide you with the best possible image quality and which takes the least amount of performance hit on your system? Let's find out. Now, to start off with, let me show you the 3 different methods that I've mentioned before on how you can rescale your live stream. The first one is in the settings tab when you go to the video tab, and here you have the base resolution, which you usually want to match your monitor resolution. So in my case, this is 1440p. And then you have the output scaled resolution, which would be your downscaled version of the live stream. Right now I've chosen 1080p. And here we have 3 different filters. Now, the second approach is when you select the same base as well as output resolution, then you can go over to the output tab and here click on rescale output, and then once again select 1080p. Now, one thing I'd like to mention is that in the output tab we are using the encoder to downscale. So if you select X264, you downscale using the CPU, whereas on the other hand, in the video tab, you always use the GPU to downscale. Now, the final and last way on how you can rescale your live stream is by simply selecting a lower canvas resolution. So for example, if you want to do 1080p, then you just put in 1080p for both, hit apply. Now what happens is that the video capture is actually larger than your canvas here. So what you can do now is you can click on transform and then go to stretch to screen, and voila, it once again fits your screen. Now here you actually also can select different filters. So we have 5 different filters to choose from if we were to rescale in the canvas. This last method also rescales using the GPU, and I will call it canvas rescaling. Now, the first question I'd like to answer here is which out of these 9 filters is the best in terms of performance? Now, unfortunately, the answer isn't just a simple use this or that, because it actually depends on the game you're playing, the resolution you're playing at, the resolution that you stream at, and finally also on the encoder that you're using. So in order to test this very manifold problem, I have actually run a few different benchmarks with 3 different games and 1 GPU benchmark. I am using both the X264 as well as the NVENC codec with the settings that I'm showing here, and I don't have any other sources in my OBS Studio. So it is really the best possible performance that you can expect when downscaling with a certain method. Now we will begin with PUBG in ultra settings and played at 1440p, and we're going to be live streaming with NVENC, so with the GPU, and using a 75% downscale. Now on this graph you can see the minimum, average and maximum frames per second using different filters, and the performance I got without streaming is shown on the bottom. Now going from bottom to top, we can see that when we use the video tab to do the downscaling, there isn't really a big difference between the different filters. Now this is a first surprise because the general notion is that Lanxess generally provides the best image quality while at the same time having the highest impact on your system. So while Bilinear provided the highest average and maximum frames per second, the minimum frames per second was actually highest for Lanxas. Moving up to encoder downscaling, we can see that the average frames per second does decrease significantly, and this is kind of a common theme whenever we are looking at encoder downscaling. We can see that this usually provides the lowest performance overall. Finally, moving up to all of the different canvas downscales. Now basically disabling downscaling should basically provide you with the highest frames per second. In this case, actually point downscaling got a little bit higher frames per second, but in general the difference between the different filters once again is pretty much negligible. However, generally average frames per second were slightly lower than downscaling using the video tab. Next we will move on to live streaming using X264, so encoding on the CPU. Encoder downscaling once again produces significantly lower frames per second in-game than downscaling using the video tab. And interestingly, using the canvas to downscale, we do get almost identical, if not even worse result than with the encoder. So in this scenario, you really don't want to be downscaling using the canvas. Moving on to the results at 960p, that is a 66% downscale, and we have the NVNC stream to the left and the X264 stream on the right. Considering NVENC to stream, we can still see that using the encoder to downscale our footage still produces the lowest frames per second overall. On the other hand, disabling any downscaling and downscaling using the canvas actually produces the highest frames per second. But to be honest, the differences are almost negligible, so let's move on to X264 streaming. Notice that the overall frames per second and especially the minimum frames per second decrease significantly going from NVENC to X264. Now interestingly, in this case, encoder downscaling produces the second highest performance in-game over all different filters. So that is a bit of an oddball result there, but in general, canvas and video downscaling doesn't produce terribly different results, and therefore it's actually hard to tell which one you should use simply judging by performance. Finally, we're going to look at live streaming at 720p, which corresponds to a downscale of 50%. Starting off once again with the NVNC live stream, we can see that the different filters in the video tab and the different filters on the canvas actually produce somewhat similar performance in game. Once again, encoder downscaling is the worst in terms of performance. And finally, we find some interesting results when looking at X264. Now, this is the first time where the average and minimum frames per second actually increased compared to streaming using NVENC. While encoder downscaling once again produces the lowest performance in-game, we can actually see that in this case, canvas downscaling does produce significantly better results in-game compared to downscaling using the video tab. Now, within one of these two respective options, it doesn't really matter in terms of performance which filter you're using, because the overall performance is pretty much identical regardless of the filter chosen. Now, what I think happens in this particular situation is that